So, what led you to be a therapist? Why did you decide to take that route rather than be a ballet dancer or a engineer?
I'm 5'11" and bad at math, so no. I actually started going to therapy when I was 16 or 15 probably, um, because of my own sort of childhood depression, anxiety, which I didn't recognize as anxiety at the time, but that was very, very helpful for me. So I remember just feeling, very heard and a place where I could go and talk about stuff that was going on in my family or at school, that felt very freeing and non-judgmental. And so I actually decided very early that that's what I wanted to do. So, and then I just went right to college and then went right to graduate school and kind of always worked. I worked with people with disabilities, babies with disabilities, when I was in college, and then worked at a camp for both adults and children with special needs, for 13 years. So I sort of have always been in this social worky kind of field.
How does it work being a mother? I mean, it's tempting to say, I hear you feeling da 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 about da da da. Tell me about how you're feeling. Do your
Right.
kids say, don't be a therapist, be a mom? Or does it work?
Yeah, it's funny. They don't. And I think that I'm maybe a different type of therapist, in the sense that I am very relational. And I mean, of course, I ask those questions, but I think I'm maybe less scripted than some might be. And so they rarely say it to me. I do hear them say to other adults sometimes, like, well, my mom's a therapist, so, but, yeah, I don't know. Maybe as they get older, they'll sort of recognize the difference with other adults. But I think it's hard. There's certainly a lot of awareness that I have as a parent, which can be really helpful. It can also be scary. And there are many, many times when I know I should be doing or saying something that I'm not, you know. So I think I can easily get kind of swept into I'm a parent and I'm not able, even if I wanted to kind of put on that therapist hat.
When I think about child rearing principles, this is kind of an end note. The what seems to me to really work is the how to talk so children will listen so children will talk approach, where you don't lecture or
Right.
monologue. Consequences speak for you, like Dreiker's Children the Challenge book.
Mhm.
What principles would you say are key in being an authoritative rather than authoritarian or permissive parent, neither of which poles work?
Yeah, I mean, since my kids were really little, we've talked about difficult subjects. And so there's never been, at least as far as I know, there have never been topics that can't be discussed in our household. And I think that has been really helpful. My husband and I are both really open with our kids about what's going on in our families of origin, and very open about our own feelings. And I think that has just sort of created a place where they feel like they can be also, hopefully. Um, we don't have a lot of rules in our house other than, you need to be kind to people and things that are alive, and be respectful. And so I think, have always felt pretty trusted that they can do what they want to do as long as they're, being respectful about it. Um, so I think not having something to really butt up against, has made it so that when there is something that they want to do that they're not totally sure is okay, they're willing to ask, and we've always, as they get older, this gets a little trickier, but we've always sort of said that we trust you, and then that you're going to be honest until you're not, and then we'll have to deal with that. But there are also very clear boundaries about, drinking and drugs and those kinds of things, and it helps that we don't do that. So I think that is another thing that we've always kind of been aware of modeling behavior and not saying, well, I get to do it because I'm an adult. You don't get to do it because you're a kid. I don't think that that works. So, yeah, so I think that I don't do things that I wouldn't want them to do. So, at least, within parameters. So, yeah. But they're also pretty clear about what's okay and what's not okay.
What about roommate issues like housework and keeping your room clean and doing dishes and helping with cooking and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, of course, right now, that's a huge topic of conversation. Um, I have 3 kids. Some of them are more helpful than others. And right now they have certain jobs that they have to do. Um, and they resist a little bit, but they're willing to do it. Sometimes there need to be consequences. For us, like phones are always the number one thing to go. Which as much as I hate the dependence on phones, I also recognize it as amazing leverage. So there's that. But they're pretty helpful. I mean, what's important to me is when they're at someone else's house, that they know to bring something or ask what they can bring when they're going to someone's house for dinner, and that they know to look around them and what is that family doing, and how do you adapt to those rules, and to ask if they can be helpful, and to volunteer to do things or just do things that need to be done. So that we talk about that stuff a lot. And at home, they're pretty good about it, although sometimes I have to lose my marbles completely, screaming and yelling to get them to do it, but they do it.
Well, who does the cooking?
We all cook, actually. My husband cooks a lot. I cook. My daughter loves to bake. My 16-year-old son was baking last night. Everyone kind of helps. Yeah. They're good about helping. I try to get their input on what they want to eat and, to let me know. But they're like, if they were left home all day alone, they could definitely cook for themselves. It's not that they don't know how to. So that's important to me also. I don't want them leaving the house not knowing how to take care of themselves in that way, you know?
I know my son said that when he was a freshman at Humboldt State, there were kids who didn't know how to do their own wash. They didn't know how to use a washing machine. So
yeah.
That doesn't seem good parenting.
No. Right now our chores are someone's in charge of the kitchen, a kid, someone's in charge of the animals, and then someone's in charge of laundry. So we help, especially right now in the kitchen, it seems like it's being used all day long. We help, but that mainly they're responsible for taking care of those things, and that rotates. So
I think it makes sense to have systems like that, because then you don't have to negotiate. It's just there, and and you can plan on it, and it's fair.
yeah.
Speaking of teenage daughters, I'm been doing work on global youth activism and global youth values, and what I keep struggling with is, why is there an increase in depression and anxiety among adolescents, especially girls, in the last decade or so? Do you see that in your practice? Do you work with adolescents other than your daughter and son and their friends? And why the increase?
Well, so yes, I do work with adolescents, and I see a tremendous amount of anxiety, and I think that there's even more social pressure. And I think back to when I was, in the 90s, early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, when I was a teenager, we had fashion magazines, and there was so much pressure to look like the people in the magazines or maybe in movies. But now they are bombarded with images, and hundreds and thousands a day, right? So it's more than any of us could have experienced, even if we had tried. So I think that this whole comparison culture is huge, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure. I think, like with grades and getting into college, and then you're supposed to be beautiful and an athlete and also get a 4.8, I mean, all this crazy pressure, and it's so much. And then add the anonymity of how kids treat one another online. It's really easy to type something or to say something on Snapchat that's going to go away in a few minutes and not have to be held responsible for that. Whereas if, like when I was in junior high, if someone was going to say something mean, it was either going to be right in front of me or to one of my friends, right? And that's it's harder to do. So I think there's that. And then the lack of connection, because so much of the social time is through the devices or screens or apps or whatever, that is not, I mean, it's connection in a way. And for some, it's really helpful because the like face-to-face connection is so anxiety producing. But I think for the vast majority of teens, it takes them away from getting together. Like there's really not much of a reason to get together, right? So they don't have a lot of practice. And really what is most regulating for humans is human connection. And so they think they're getting it by being online, but they're not really connecting to one another. They're not really getting that full body sort of mirror neuron experience of being in the room with someone, noticing how they're holding themselves, the tone of their voice, the way that they're saying what they're saying. I think as humans, we really need that. And when so much of the contact is through electronics, they're really missing out on it. I see it with my kids when they do get together with friends, especially right now. We haven't gotten together with friends, but we've gone on some hikes with other families, or even when they just see each other through Zoom, they like, they brighten up, and it's so exciting for them to be close to another human, and I think that that's happening all the time. It's just exaggerated right now, and I really notice it, but we really do respond differently when we're face to face. And so if we're not getting the regulation in that way, then that's a huge part of how we regulate and emotionally. And so I think kids aren't regulating, or they're doing these other sort of harmful things to regulate.
Do you think that boys are as anxious and depressed and they just don't talk about it or express it? Or do you think there is more pressure on girls so that they are, in fact, more anxious?
I think that there's a lot of pressure on both genders. I think that, my experience, and I don't mean to sound like stereotypical, but, boys do a lot of inward processing, and then they kind of come out, and then they go back in, and then they come out. So I think for some boys, it's not quite as different for them, maybe to have less physical contact. But I do think there is still a lot of pressure. I think that it's a different type of pressure, but I think boys feel pressure, to conform in other ways and to be smart and to make a lot of money and
be athletes, strong.
Right. To be the best at something. Yeah, I do think they feel it. I think that, and we know that males have just as many feelings as females. And I think it's interesting. I think males my age, I work with a lot of first responders, males my age are in this sort of conundrum because they grew up with dads that weren't, there was a tremendous amount of stigma as far as expressing feelings or, even not even just expressing, but accessing and naming and knowing what they were feeling. And then there's this generation my age that are supposed to be open, caring, and honest and willing to talk about everything. And they don't have any models for that, or very few, So I think then our children, hopefully, are learning from the males my age, within my age range, that it really is okay to be open and to have close relationships and to share feelings other than anger and happiness. And so I think that trickle down is good. But I think it's very new in our culture for males to be allowed to express more than those two feelings. So I think it's still this kind of learning curve for them.
It's even fairly new that men hugged each other. And
Yeah.
now they still need to go pat, 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 hug while they're, little pats on the back while they hug. They can't just hug. But that's fairly new.
Yes, yes. And I notice it in like my husband and with his good friends, our good friends. They hug each other whenever they see each other, and it's so great. And so I notice then my little boys, they are super like they'll walk with their arms around each other, and I love it. Yeah, so I do think that change is happening, but you're right, it is very new. And then to put words to that, I mean, that's even, another level of awareness and openness that I think is changing, thankfully, but is it's going to take a while, I think, for that to get to be normalized.
Yeah, it used to be that boys who expressed their feelings were called queer or gay or sissy or something that was meant to be a pejorative. So it wasn't just that there wasn't encouragement, there was discouragement as well.
Yeah,
But you
yeah,
see it changing in your boys and their friends and your
I do.
clients. Yeah.
I
Oh,
do. I really do. It's great to see.
that's
Yeah.
encouraging. What do you find is the effect of the pandemic on people who are anxious or have OCD or who are maybe in danger of domestic violence? Do you see changes in your clients because of being isolated?
Yes, I do. I think that, well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do work with a lot of first responders right now, and of course, their world is not slowing down at all, right? To them, it's just this another level of exposure that they're already really aware of, but now it's so in the forefront, that it's like, okay, now I know that I'm being exposed in these ways that other people are able to protect themselves from right now, and then bringing that home to their families. I mean, I don't hear them saying they're so worried about themselves, but they have kids and wives and husbands, and they're aware of like, oh my gosh, I'm out there in this world that no one's allowed to be out in right now. And they in our area they've had a pretty traumatic last few years, and so that just sort
Because
of
of the fire, the campfire.
yes, with the campfire and the car fire and all the fires that have been so bad. So I noticed that. I think with OCD for sure, and anyone that's sort of that has a heightened hypervigilance around germs. I think that the brain recognizes this. Oh, there's an additional danger out there, right? And so it's really hard to get the that system to kind of calm down. And like I will say, like the back of our brain is the fire alarm and the front part is the filter, right? So the fire alarm is going off um, generally in people with anxiety already, and then here's a new danger, right? And so I always am trying to always get people to be present and come to the prefrontal cortex to say to themselves, okay, let's filter this. Like, am I in danger right now? Is there something that I can do to keep myself safe? Am I keeping myself safe? Um, so yeah, you know, I think it will be interesting as time goes on that, we all have our coping strategies, healthy and not so healthy. And those of us with not so healthy coping strategies are, as it gets longer and longer, it's harder to use the healthy strategies. And people get tired, and in situations where people aren't making money or they're alone and they don't want to be, that kind of desperation adds to the anxiety, and then people tend to cope in ways that are not um, as healthy. So I worry a lot about substance abuse. I worry a lot about violence in relationship to partner violence, but also violence with children specifically, which is a huge thing in our culture that we don't really talk about. But children often get the brunt of adults who can't manage their emotion. So I do worry about that. And for many kids, we know that school is their break. It is their safe place. So yeah, I worry about kids that don't have that right now.
What do you suggest to people as coping mechanisms, in addition to saying, let's come to the forebrain and think this through.
Yeah. I mean, for me, moving their bodies and being outside are two of the most important things. Because, a lot of anxiety and trauma occurs when we're stuck, right? Physically stuck, and we in a situation where we can't move through it. And so helping people recognize that moving their bodies, even if they can't go out, but moving their bodies in their home, just the act of moving sort of tells the brain, like, oh, I'm not stuck. I don't have to endure whatever is happening right now. I have a way of moving through this.
I have control. I have some power.
Yes, yeah. So, and then exercise is just so important. And it is one of the things that I've noticed in the last few weeks that is just so beautiful is all the people who are getting outside. I mean, it's really great. So I think that is something, especially for kids, they need to get outside, and be able to move and be able to put their feet in the grass and kind of be grounded in that way.
What you use a particular kind of brain balancing for PTSD. What is that?
Um, well, I do brain spotting, and brain spotting came off of EMDR. And so brain spotting is a way of identifying a symptom or something that is difficult, and then finding a position physically finding a position with the eyes, and then listening to bilateral music, so it's stimulating both sides of the brain. And the therapist is actually quite removed or quiet during the process. But when people can fix their eyes in the place that is more activating, thinking about the problem or the issue or the thing that's bothering them, the brain can kind of sort through that situation like it would if it was filing that memory in a healthy way. And it's very regulating for people. People come out of brain spotting sessions feeling much less activated by whatever it is they were thinking of. And it's very similar to EMDR, but the bilateral stimulation is through the music, not so much through the eye movement. And so, yeah, I mean, I just did a session this week over Zoom, which was interesting, but it was helpful for the person. And we do it anyway. We all find, I notice this as a therapist, that we all, as we're talking about something, our eyes will go to a certain place. And often, especially when people are getting really emotional, that happens. And so this is a way of kind of like helping them pause in that place to allow the brain to do what it needs to do without them feeling like they have to come back and make eye contact, or without them feeling like they have to do anything other than just kind of let their brain do what it's supposed to do.
A lot of people are using energy psychology's meridian tapping, like emotional freedom technique, which is nice because anybody can do it. And I wondered if you've had any experience with acupressure point tapping and what you think of it.
Yeah, I do some tapping, and I'm not like an expert in it at all. But I did learn it when I was at a conference Bessel van der Kolk's conference. He had us all do some tapping, and it was super calming. And so I do, in fact, I forget who it was, but they just asked me this week, my mom said that you should help me do some tapping. I was like, oh yeah, let's do some tapping. So I do that a lot in sessions, and I also do it with like my nephews when they're losing their marbles. I'm like, let's do some tapping. And people will say, well, what is it doing? And I'm like, well, I mean, I think it's all about being present, right? So as we're really physically thinking about tapping or touching our bodies and where we're touching and what that sensation is, it's hard to do that and think about what might happen tomorrow that's scary, right? Or what did happen last week that was awful. So being present is so important in the whole mindfulness, way of, it's hard to be really present and really anxious at the same time. So, so I think it's great. I mean, I tell people there's nothing wrong or right. If it feels better for you and it's not, and it's healthy, then try it. But yeah, I think tapping is wonderful also because you really can kind of do it anywhere, and there's a lot of resource online to watch, right? So that it's not something that is like, oh, only if you pay $3,000 and get trained for 8 weeks can you do this.
Right, right.
Yeah.
What do you think is the role of pharmaceuticals? I'm thinking, for example, psychiatrists used to spend many hours a week talking with a patient, and they would do talk therapy. But then that became too expensive, and so now there's a push for psychiatrists to see a patient for 15 minutes. And so I wondered where you think pharmaceuticals get involved in treating someone with anxiety and depression or OCD or PTSD. What's the role of drugs?
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think that when I'm working with someone, there are so many factors that go into the sort of when I start to talk to them about medication if they're not already on that path. I think we get confused culturally about like sadness and depression. So someone might come in and they're very sad about something that has happened, which is a very healthy and normal reaction to many situations. And so people will come in and they're sad and they say, oh my God, this is so awful, feeling this way. And I want it to go away. And I think saying, well, let's get some medication is not healthy, right? Because sadness is a feeling we really need to move through. And many times we have a lot of reason to be sad, and that's important and okay. When I talk to someone who has, can't remember when they weren't depressed, and they're doing the things, they're exercising, and they're trying to have meaningful relationships, and they eat healthy food, and they take time, with the people that they love and trying to do the things they like, but they still wake up every morning and they're very depressed, then that's a different situation, right? And sometimes there are chemical issues that we can't think our way out of, we can't behave our way out of sometimes. With anxiety, I think it's similar, so people will say, well, I get anxious when I'm doing this thing. And sometimes that thing is anxiety producing, right? And so learning that, well, your body is just letting you know this is something that's a little bit scary. It's kind of getting worked, up for it. But then because I work with a lot of first responders, some of them they've been in the fight place for 20 years. And that dysregulation is so ingrained that any amount of exercise and thought stopping and mindfulness and all of it's not working, right? And so sometimes with those folks, it's really important to get medication on board because it just calms down the amygdala enough that they can then learn new strategies and the brain can shift so that it will allow itself to use the filter, right? But if we really truly have been in danger a long, long time, I think that medication is often necessary to calm that down. And then I see people who take the medication for a while and they kind of learn more coping strategies, and it's almost like their brain has reset, and then they're able to go off the medication because now it's just like it's been reset. They're able to use both their whole brain more. Psychiatry is an amazing science, and I think that if asked, most psychiatrists would say, I wish I could take an hour and a half or an hour with my clients. I don't think they like it either. What I have found works best is when I can find a psychiatrist that is interested and wants to have my input, because they know that I do spend a lot of time with that person, And they are hard to find, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, but partly I know it's time, that their time is precious and expensive. But when I can work with a therapist or a psychiatrist where I can let them know who I'm sending, obviously with the client's permission, what I see, what I think is going on, and then they can see that person and then call me back and say, hey, this is what I think we're going to do. Does this seem right to you? That's when it seems like it works. When it's really disjointed, I think that it's really hard because I think sometimes they don't get enough information,
Well, and studies show that a lot of times meds don't work. I mean,
Right.
people can take them, but after a year, maybe 30% really benefit. So why do you think that is, that it's such an iffy results with pharmaceuticals?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I see that with depression quite frequently, that there isn't really a big change. I with clients that I have that are really, really anxious, the medication or some medication almost always makes a difference.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so, and there's still a tremendous amount of stigma around medication. And so I always remind people, if it doesn't work, something different. You don't have to, this is not a commitment forever. Um,
But it does change
yeah,
your cell receptors. Things get changed when you do meds, just like when you do drugs.
exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah, so it is a big risk. But I think when everything else has been, when a person has tried everything else, that, I know it's a really difficult choice sometimes, but I also know that if life is really miserable, right, sometimes it's worth that trying. Um, often I find that people are taking medication, but they're also drinking, or they're also, smoking marijuana, or they're also smoking cigarettes, or drinking a tremendous amount of coffee, or doing all these other things.
Mm.
And so it's really hard. Like, well, maybe the medication's not working because you're also adding all these other substances into your body. So I think that often is the case, that people are taking medication and they don't feel like it's working. Maybe it's the wrong medication, but also maybe they're doing something else that's sort of counteracting what might be helpful of the medication. So
Um, there's talk that some families have a genetic predisposition to be happy, unhappy, anxious, depressed, or whatever it is. How much do you think is nature? How much is nurture? Bruce Lipton talks about how our gene expression can change because of our environment. So
yeah.
I'm interested in what you see in terms of genetic influences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so difficult to sort out nature and nurture, right? Because they are so intertwined. Our environment creates these responses in our bodies that are chemical, which are now nature, right? I mean, it's so hard to sort it out. I do think that we learn from our families a lot. I think we learn if the world is safe or the world is not safe from our families, um, and not just in behavior, but also with our genetics, right? We know that epigenetics, things that change. So, yeah, I think, and then we have, you hear of people who are born into a family and everyone else sort of continues on with whatever that family was like, and then one of the kids does not. So, and it's hard sometimes to sort out what that is. I think it's very important to know not only what our genetic predisposition is, but also what our like family cultural, predisposition is. And we will do what our parents do unless we really think about it, And so I think that when I learn, it's interesting because people will come in the office and they'll start to talk about something, and then and the way that they deal with stress, or the way that they deal with difficulty in relationship. And then once I learn about how they grew up, it's like, well, of course you do, right? That totally makes sense. Not that you can't change it, right? Now that you certainly can learn to do it differently and change how it is, but it usually totally makes sense the way that people deal, especially with difficult emotions, when I hear about how it was dealt with in their family. And then it's even more interesting to then go back, like, well, how did your parents grow up? Right? So learning about how someone's parents grew up, then it seems to, usually it all makes sense, right? It all kind of comes together. But I think that, I think there used to be this idea that, like, well, you're born this way and you can't change it. And now we know that that's not true, that the brain actually is very plastic and does change. And I think that that's encouraging, because people really, they might say, well, I just grew up in a family of alcoholics. It's like, well, yeah, but if you don't drink, you won't be an alcoholic, And in fact, you can learn about what goes on, like, in your system that, that causes anxiety, that makes you want to do something that's soothing. And then you can learn how to soothe yourself in a way that's healthy. So, I think it's important information. I think that there are some things, obviously, that we just can't escape as far as how our bodies are. But with behavior and emotional state, I think often we have a lot more influence by doing something different than we believe we do.
You mentioned when we started talking that you suffered from anxiety when you were a teen. And when you look back, what would you say were the reasons why you felt that way?
Well, I had an alcoholic father. I had a brother who had a very difficult time. I'm the middle kid. I hate to play the middle card, but there's that. I also was very different from my peers, or felt very different from my peers. So I kind of wasn't into the thing, like, socially. I had good friends, but I didn't have a boyfriend. I didn't have these things that I thought everyone else had that would make me so happy, and I just had a tremendous amount of awareness, kind of a hypervigilance of awareness around myself and other people. So I think that I didn't even recognize how much anxiety I had until now, watching my oldest, who's 16, watching him kind of go through the 12, 13, 14-year-old phase, and being able to do these things that I never would have been able to do. And like, oh my gosh, he does not have anxiety. That's the difference, right? He'll get dressed and go to the dance by himself and have a great time. And I never would have thought of going to a dance by myself ever, So that, I think, is when I really started to recognize, oh yeah, I had a tremendous amount of anxiety that I don't know that I even voiced, but I certainly felt it. I think, and I think that my mom has anxiety, I think, so I just think that I also sort of learned that, not that she did anything wrong, but she was very cautious, and she was always like, oh, I hope this doesn't happen, and, that kind of stuff. And so I think I got messages also along the way that the world isn't necessarily safe.
And then how did you unlearn that kind of hypervigilance and the worry syndrome? Was it from your therapist, or how did you evolve?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I would say that I still have anxiety, but now I'm a lot more aware of it. When I had my first baby, I had a huge wave of anxiety, that I was going to die. I was certain every time I left the house that I was going to die. And
is that while you were pregnant or after the birth?
After. Yeah. No, while I was pregnant, I did not have a lot of anxiety. It was after, just like this. I think all of a sudden, this sort of preciousness of my responsibility to him, all of that just was so overwhelming. So I really had to I still have to talk to myself a lot about it, and just check in and notice when I'm anxious and why am I anxious, and is that really something that I need to worry about, or is it something I have no control over? Is it something that I'm imagining? So now I just am really trying to practice what I preach and be just notice when it's happening, and then like where is it in my body and what do I need? What's really going to help? Not what's going to shove it away, but what do I need in order to connect with someone or to kind of work through it in that way.
So you kind of do cognitive behavioral therapy with yourself.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, a lot of it. Yeah, and just also just trying to be really present, I think, is helpful.
Interesting. Last question is, the World Health Organization predicts that in a couple of decades, depression will be the world's major health issue. Do you have any thoughts about why that's going to be a global the major health issue?
Yeah. I think again the lack of connection. I think that we have really lost our I don't want to say our desire or even our I mean, I think we all want to be connected. I just think that we've culturally lost behaviors and situations that connect us. I think most people feel pretty lonely, even when they're with people. And, as humans, being alone is a death sentence for us from the moment we're born. And so I think that I'm hoping that this pandemic, us like being sort of stuck at home, helps us to reminds us what it is like to be first together with our families, and not. I know for us, for my family, not running kids around all afternoon, and we can eat dinner together again, and so doing those kinds of things that we don't do very often. People always, throughout history and still in other places, sat together a lot, right? Or danced or did things together in groups that were very physical and very connecting. And most people, I think, have kind of lost that. And we need it. I think we need it to not be depressed. So, and then also just the addiction in the world. I saw a great meme, I guess it was, that said like addiction, and then it had like an equal sign and a slash to the equal sign, connection. And when we're addicted, we can't be connected. And when we're not connected, we tend to get addicted. So I think that, as people use substances, they're less and less connected to themselves, and then their capacity to connect to others is greatly diminished.
And the same is true for social media.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I'm not just talking about substance use, right? I mean, I'm talking about spending and, I always say eating chocolate chips, going to Target too much. I mean, all these things that we do that take us, that we dissociate, that take us away from ourselves. And my hope is that, that people start to figure out like, oh, that doesn't work. It doesn't work to try to get out of myself. Does not make it any better. It only makes it worse,
How does the increase in autism fit in with this kind of disconnection? Do you see any correlation?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, I think that they are finding, that autism is very genetic. They're like, I don't remember the number, but like thousands of genetic markers for autism, which I think, I mean, I have so many thoughts about it. I think that partly it's hard to talk about this without people. I don't want to ever, have parents feeling like, oh, I did the wrong thing, and that's why I have a child with autism, because I don't think that that's true. But I do feel like even culturally, our disconnect makes people who have different ways of being even more isolated, right? So I think that there have always been people who are really different, but when we were in smaller communities and cultures, that was more acceptable and people took care of those people just naturally, But when we get really disconnected and parents are disconnected, and now they have this child that feels and seems really different, but there's still stigma around that, and maybe they don't have a group of people that really they feel loved by. Then they're even further isolated, and when you're really isolated and dealing with a difficult baby or a difficult toddler or child, that it makes it even worse and harder, so I don't think that, they used to say, well, when kids had autism, it was like cold mother syndrome or something like that, right? They thought it was because moms, couldn't connect. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because there are many moms who are very connected to their, all their children, including their child with autism, but their child still has autism. So, yeah, I just think that, we need to kind of get over this idea that a person is this one certain thing, and you're only good if you look and act and do this list of behaviors. I think that that's not, it's not healthy for anyone, because it's not even true. It's made up.
Greta
right?
Thunberg makes the case that her seeing the world differently is creative and gives her new perspective and new ways of doing things. So for her, she looks at it as an asset.
Yes. And I think that we have such fear of people with differences, but when we really get to know people who are different than us, almost always, it is so enlightening, and there's such a beautiful awareness and awakening that we have. It's just culturally, we just have this fear of difference, which is so ridiculous, Yeah, I just watched the movie Crip Camp. Have you heard of it?
Mm-mm.
Well, so it's produced by Michelle and Barack Obama, and it's about a camp in upstate New York in the 60s that was crippled people. That's why it's called Crip Camp. That's what they called it. And then they became their kids that had gone to this camp became the activists that eventually passed and really was a huge movement for the 504 and the ADA Acts in the late 70s. So it's a phenomenal movie. I would so encourage people to watch it, because it was very much like the camp that I worked at, and it is just sort of highlights this idea of, in this case, people with physical disabilities, that they're somehow so different from anybody else, and really they're not, but I think that if we have to start being more accepting of first ourselves and then others around us, and with that acceptance will come connection,
You've kind of had to experience that being a tall teenage girl, right?
Yeah.
People could say giraffe and I don't know what other kind of names.
Oh, yeah.
That's not pleasant.
No, it was not at all. It was awful. But interestingly for me, I was a basketball player, and, in high school I was tall. I'm 5'11", but then I went to college and played basketball, and I was short. So it was no longer, it was like, oh, how interesting, this paradigm shift, I played basketball with girls who were 6'1", 6'2", 6'3", and so that was so interesting to now. It's like, wow, how fascinating that this felt so, like, I felt like such an oddball, and now I'm like just totally middle of the road, Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's all about your perspective and who you're around, and how people are about your differences that can make things really, really either positive or negative experience for people.
Mm-hmm. I had a little bit of that experience because I was always the shortest girl in my class, and then I grew really fast, and I remember running into a boy that I knew in elementary school and middle school. Oh, Gail, you got so tall. How could you be so tall? And people did treat me differently being a little girl and a taller person.
Yes.
I didn't get patted on the head.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting now because I'm, as a therapist, I'm sitting a lot of the time, and And when I taught at Butte, it was the same way, but people would stand up next to me and they go, "Oh my gosh, you're really tall." It's like, yeah, I know. But it doesn't bother me at all anymore. And my daughter she's 14 and she's a little bit taller than I am. So, I remember when she was born and, as she was a toddler, she was a tall toddler. And I remember telling the pediatrician, who was also my pediatrician, I remember thinking, oh, Dr. Stanley, she's going to be tall. And he said, it's not going to be like it was for you. And he was right. I didn't believe him at the time, but she feels taller than the boys, but she does not feel badly about being tall in this culture. So that's good. I'm so happy to see that.
Does she play basketball?
She does not. Of course not.
Of course not. Anything else that you'd like to add that you help people cope during difficult times or
Oh,
deal with
yeah.
these
I mean,
issues?
I think just practicing kindness to ourselves and the people that we're living with as much as we can, and connecting and just like sort of allowing this to feel. I mean, to me, it feels like the whole earth is saying, you got to take a break, everybody. You
That's
have
right.
to take a break.
I feel
You-
that too.
Yeah. And easy for me to say, I'm not sick on a ventilator somewhere, right? But so I think just having compassion for one another, for ourselves, you know, practicing being grateful and grateful for the people that are out there doing the hard work, and grateful for the time that we have, and just all of anything that like kind of helps us to focus on what's really going on for us.
Good. Great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.